He waited for hours in the desert, and then a miracle happened. It was the kind of morning that made the desert seem endless. The sun struck the sand with a merciless gaze, turning every rock and ridge into a mirror of heat. But amid the emptiness, a small, fragile life lay unnoticed. A newborn, left in a basket that seemed impossibly tiny against the vast expanse. Then came a shadow, broad and purposeful. A German shepherd appeared from the horizon, muscles rippling, tail stiff, eyes burning with instinct. He didn't sniff, didn't hesitate. He moved straight to the child and took his post, standing guard like a sentinel who had known his duty long before humans could intervene. No one else had come. No one else was expected. And yet the bond formed in that moment was profound. A brush of the dog's tongue against a trembling hand, a protective stance that spoke volumes without a single sound. This was a silent agreement. I will not let anything happen to you. What followed was a journey through danger, doubt, and human failings. But in that instant, in the shadow of loyalty and love, a miracle began. And it would change the lives of everyone who came near it forever. The desert had a way of swallowing sound. Out here, on the endless ribbon of asphalt that split the wasteland in two, even the low hum of Richard Coleman's Mercedes seemed fragile, like it might dissolve into the shimmering heat. He gripped the steering wheel tightly, knuckles pale, eyes darting to the horizon where the road dissolved into waves of mirage. The late afternoon sun bore down with merciless weight, turning the air into a furnace. Cicadas screamed from invisible perches, and dust devils twisted lazily across the hardpan. The American desert was vast, cruel, and indifferent. It was a place where secrets could vanish without echo. In the back seat, a wicker basket rested awkwardly against the leather upholstery. A thin white blanket was tucked inside, and beneath it, a newborn squirmed. Her frail body racked with sobs that seemed too small for the emptiness around her. Every cry pierced Richard's chest like a shard of glass. He adjusted the rearview mirror once, then again, as though trying to block the sight of her. But her tiny fists waved in the corner of his vision, insistent, unforgiving. "God help me," he whispered. But the words evaporated into the thick air before they could reach his own ears. Paranoia sat beside him like an uninvited passenger. Sweat pooled at the back of his neck, not only from the desert heat, but from the storm of fear inside him. He thought of his partner, Vargas, sharp-eyed, ruthless, a man who had once said with a calm smile, "Loose ends sink empires, Richard. And you've got one crying in a cradle." The infant's wail rose again, thin but relentless, cutting through the hum of the tires. Richard flinched. He pressed harder on the accelerator, though the highway stretched on without mercy. Each mile carried him deeper into nowhere, to his left and right, scrub brush, sand, and the occasional skeleton of a Joshua tree. No homes, no gas stations, no witnesses. His mind drifted, back to the sterile boardroom where Vargas had leaned close, voice a whisper, but heavy with menace. "You want your empire intact? Then you erase every liability, even if it wears a diaper." Richard had nodded, outwardly composed, but inside, terror clawed at him. He had built his fortune on calculated risks, on outmaneuvering competitors with a predator's grace. But this act was not business. It was betrayal, made flesh. The baby hiccuped, her cries softening into whimpers. Richard risked another glance in the mirror. For an instant, her eyes fluttered open, wide, searching, innocent. Something inside him cracked. He remembered another set of eyes. Years ago, when his first daughter was born. The hospital smell of antiseptic, the sharp light, the nurse placing the swaddled bundle in his arms, the overwhelming sense that he had been given something eternal, something pure. He had promised her, promised himself, that he would always protect her. Now here he was, barreling down a desert road with another helpless child, his blood thundering with fear, his soul shrinking beneath the weight of Vargas's threats. The steering wheel trembled under his grip. He eased the car to the shoulder, gravel spitting beneath the tires. The engine ticked as he shifted into park, and for a moment the silence pressed in, broken only by the baby's restless mewling. Richard stared ahead at the flat line of horizon. He could feel his shirt clinging to his back, the salt of sweat stinging his eyes. He pressed his palms against the wheel, forehead dropping to rest on the ridge of his hands. "This isn't me," he muttered. "This isn't who I am." But wasn't it? The empire he had clawed together was built on compromises, each one chipping away at who he once thought himself to be. This was only the next, larger compromise. His heart pounded as he turned to the back seat. The basket sat quietly, its wicker sides glowing in the slanted sun. The blanket shifted with the baby's movements, tiny fingers curling and uncurling in restless rhythm. Richard's throat tightened. The world outside the window was an oven of sand and silence. Inside the car, the air reeked of leather, sweat, and fear. He reached back, resting his hand on the handle of the basket. For a moment, he imagined lifting it out, carrying it into the desert, placing it beneath some forgotten stone. He imagined walking back to the car, closing the door, driving away, his life intact, his empire safe. But another image followed fast. Headlines screaming, "Businessman rescues orphaned infant." He pictured cameras flashing, his smile carefully rehearsed. The infant held aloft as though she were proof of his magnanimity. The crowd would cheer. The scandal would vanish. Then Vargas's voice returned, colder than the desert night. "If you don't erase this, I will, and you won't like how I do it." Richard's hand trembled on the handle. He pulled it back sharply, chest heaving. The baby's cry grew louder, shriller, like a plea, like an accusation. The desert stretched endless around them, no sign of mercy. Richard closed his eyes. The engine idled, a soft purr against the weight of silence. Somewhere deep inside, a man who once believed in love and family begged him to turn the car around, to hold the infant close, to defy Vargas. But that voice was faint now, drowned in the roar of ambition and fear. He shifted the car back into gear. The Mercedes crept forward, carrying basket and burden deeper into nowhere. The sun sank lower, casting long shadows across the road. Dust swirled up behind the tires, a veil for the betrayal unfolding. The desert was ready to keep its secret. The milestone rose from the dust like a forgotten bone, half-buried, weather-worn, its numbers faded from years of sun. No cars passed on this stretch of highway. The desert held its breath, as if complicit in what was about to unfold. Richard Coleman eased the Mercedes to a stop beside the marker, gravel crunching under the tires, the engine idling with a low hum. He sat, frozen, both hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his fingers burned. For a long moment, he didn't move. Only the baby's thin, relentless cries filled the silence. His chest heaved. Sweat trickled down his temples, slipped into his eyes, mixed with the sting of dust. He wiped his face with the back of his sleeve, leaving streaks across his skin. Every breath felt like inhaling fire. He turned his head slowly, as though fearing what he would see. There, in the back seat, lay the wicker basket. The blanket had slipped, exposing the baby's face, red, damp, crumpled in distress. Tiny fists beat weakly against the air, her mouth opening and closing like a drowning swimmer, gasping for breath. Richard's stomach twisted. He opened the door and stepped out. The desert hit him like a wall. Heat shimmering in waves, air dry enough to crack bone. His expensive shoes sank into the loose dust at the shoulder. For a heartbeat, he thought of nothing but the oppressive stillness. Even the cicadas had gone silent. He opened the rear door with hands that trembled, the leather creaking as he leaned in. His fingers closed around the basket's handles. The wicker felt rough against his palms, too light, far too fragile to contain the weight of what it carried. He lifted it carefully, as though afraid it might break apart in his grip. The baby's cries sharpened at the sudden movement, piercing the barren air. He staggered slightly, not from the weight, but from the enormity of the act. Each step toward the milestone felt like walking through sand that pulled him down, begging him to stop. The milestone offered a sliver of shade, a crooked shadow no wider than a coffin lid. Richard knelt there, setting the basket gently beneath it. Dust swirled in the faint breeze, clinging to the blanket. He crouched beside it, shoulders hunched, staring down. The baby blinked up at him, eyes glassy with tears. For a moment, everything else, the desert, Vargas, the empire he had clawed together, fell away. All he saw was a helpless life, raw and new, looking at him with something like trust. His chest tightened painfully. Memories assaulted him. His eldest daughter's laughter in their garden, her small hand curling around his finger. Her first words spoken with shy triumph. He remembered holding her against his chest and whispering promises he had never fully kept. The desert blurred. He raised his hand, brushing sweat from his brow, but it came away wet with more than sweat. He did not want to know if it was tears. Richard leaned closer, hands hovering over the basket. His breath caught. He could lift her back into the car. He could turn the wheel around, drive back toward the city, face Vargas's wrath with whatever courage remained in him. Maybe there would be a way, some explanation, some lie to buy time. Maybe he could shield her, protect her, hide her from the world that sought to erase her. His fingers brushed the edge of the blanket. The baby shifted, a small hand breaking free to clutch at nothing. For one terrible, tender second, he almost picked her up. Almost. But fear slithered back in, cold and merciless. Vargas's voice echoed in his skull. Loose ends sink empires. And you've got one crying in a cradle. The weight of it crushed him. He imagined Vargas's methods, crueler than his own. If he hesitated, if he defied him, Vargas would not only destroy the child, he would destroy Richard too. Everything he had built, every carefully stacked stone of his empire, would collapse, and perhaps worse. He would suffer before it ended. The moment of humanity flickered out like a candle snuffed by wind. With a shuddering breath, Richard pulled his hand back. He staggered to his feet, wiping his palms on his trousers, as though the act might erase the feel of wicker, of innocence, of guilt. His chest rose and fell in ragged waves. The baby's cry followed him, sharp and thin, a sound far too small to fill such an endless desert, but it clung to him all the same. He forced himself back to the car, each step heavier than the last. He opened the driver's door and sank inside. His whole body shook. For a long moment he sat motionless, head bowed, fists pressed to his forehead. The baby's cries rose and fell, carried on the wind, and each one drove deeper into him like a nail. Finally, with a groan that was half sob, half curse, Richard started the engine. The Mercedes roared to life, drowning the sound of the child. He gripped the wheel with damp, slippery hands and forced his foot onto the accelerator. As the car pulled away, dust rose behind him, a dirty veil that curled around the milestone and the basket beneath it. In the rearview mirror, Richard saw the shrinking figure, a flicker of blanket, a sliver of wicker, a fragile life swallowed by silence. His breath hitched. For a moment, he thought he might stop, slam on the brakes, turn back, but the road ahead stretched clean and empty, and fear drove him harder than any conscience could. The cries faded, muffled by distance, until only the desert remained. Dust and silence. Richard did not look back again. The Mercedes lunged forward, tires grinding over loose gravel, until the car found its rhythm again on the hot ribbon of asphalt. Richard's hands clamped the wheel as though letting go might kill him. His breath came short, jagged, caught somewhere between sobs and curses. The leather seat burned through his shirt, sticky with sweat. In the rearview mirror, the desert's glare turned everything into mirage. But for a moment, he could still see it. The milestone, the crooked shadow cast by the sun. And beneath it, the wicker basket, small and fragile against the vast expanse. The blanket fluttered as the baby moved, a white flicker in the furnace light. Her cries carried farther than they should have, thin, desperate. The sound cut through the sealed windows, through the steady roar of the engine, through the beating of his heart. Each note was like a ghostly tether pulling at him, urging him to turn back. He gritted his teeth, shaking his head violently. "No," he hissed, as if arguing with himself, as if the desert might listen. The figure in the mirror shrank, first a small dot, then nothing more than a smudge against the horizon. And finally, gone. The silence that followed was unbearable. Richard pressed harder on the accelerator. The speedometer climbed. The road blurred ahead, long and unbroken. But no matter how fast he drove, he couldn't outrun the sound of that last cry. It clung to him, echoing inside the hollow chambers of his chest. He wiped at his face with his sleeve, but the wetness lingered. Sweat, or tears, he no longer knew. His throat felt raw, his vision blurred. The desert stretched endlessly around him, sand baked white, scrub brush scattered like bones, the heat shimmering like smoke. It was a world designed to erase things. Footprints vanished, corpses dried to dust, secrets buried themselves in silence. And now, somewhere behind him, a newborn lay abandoned, her life entrusted to a merciless wasteland. The symbolism clawed at his thoughts. The road had always been his lifeline, highways carrying him toward success, contracts, wealth. Now it was something else. A grave marker stretched across miles of asphalt, a testament to his betrayal. His chest heaved again, nausea swirling. For an instant, he nearly veered the wheel, nearly turned the car around. The image of the baby, fists weakly grasping at the air, burned against his eyelids. He imagined himself lifting her again, holding her against his chest, whispering, "It's going to be all right, little one. I made a mistake. I'm taking you home." But then Vargas's voice returned, low, cutting, merciless. "Loose ends sink empires. You want everything gone? I can arrange it. But you won't like the way it ends." The terror was stronger than love, stronger than humanity. He pressed harder on the gas, pushing the car to 90. Dust billowed behind him, a storm that swallowed the milestone and the basket in its choking embrace. In his mirror, even the desert itself seemed to rise up to cover the evidence of his weakness. Still, silence was never total. The cries lingered, not in the air, but in his head, thin, piercing, unforgettable. They would not leave him. Richard's hands trembled on the wheel. The road unrolled endlessly, yet he felt trapped, caged inside his own choices. The desert around him no longer looked like open freedom. It looked like judgment. Every shadow on the sand, every shimmer in the heat, felt like an eye watching him. He muttered again, voice hoarse, "This isn't me. This isn't me." But the road knew better. The road carried the weight of what had been done. A vulture circled overhead, black wings carving against the white sky. Richard's gaze flicked up at it, a shiver crawling down his spine. The bird dipped lower, then drifted toward the direction he had come. His stomach lurched. The desert road now held a secret that no man could ever speak aloud. And Richard knew, secrets like that never stayed buried forever. He drove on, deeper into the heat, into the silence, into the terrible truth of himself. The land around Silver Creek stretched flat and stubborn beneath the midday sun. A quilt of parched farmland, sagging fences, an endless sky. Heat shimmered above the asphalt, making the horizon ripple like liquid. Dust clung to the air, stirred by the faintest breeze, hanging heavy over the quiet country road. A police cruiser rolled along at a steady pace, its engine humming low against the silence. Behind the wheel sat Officer David Miller, his gaze fixed forward, his posture disciplined, yet tired. He was in his mid-30s, broad-shouldered, with the kind of weary calm that came from years of service, first as a soldier overseas, then as a cop back home. His life had been one long patrol, different uniforms, same weight. Beside him, on the passenger seat, sat Ranger. The German shepherd's body was taut with muscle, his ears pricked, his amber eyes scanning the fields beyond the glass. Every twitch of his ear, every subtle shift of his shoulders, carried purpose. He looked less like a pet than a soldier himself, trained, disciplined, utterly alive to the world around him. David's hand rested lightly on the steering wheel, the other near the gear shift. Occasionally his fingers brushed the canine's thick fur, a wordless reassurance. Ranger responded with the smallest flick of his tail, never turning his head, never breaking his focus. The monotony of the day wrapped around them. It was the kind of afternoon that tested patience, the kind where nothing happened, where the silence was louder than any call for help. David felt it in his bones. Out here, on patrol near the farmlands, most days blurred together. A broken fence, a stray cow wandering onto the road, the occasional dispute between neighbors about water rights or property lines. He exhaled slowly, eyes tracing the endless row of telephone poles along the highway, each one standing solitary against the pale sky. They reminded him of soldiers in formation, long forgotten, holding their ground no matter how many years passed. His gaze slid to Ranger again. The dog was still, head lifted, eyes sharp. Always on, always waiting. David envied that certainty. He adjusted the brim of his cap and leaned back in the seat. Another day in paradise, partner, he muttered, his voice dry with a kind of humor that didn't quite reach his eyes. Ranger's ears twitched at the sound, acknowledging him, but offering no answer. Dogs didn't need words. Their silence spoke enough. The cruiser's tires hummed against the road, steady and repetitive, like a heartbeat stretched across miles. Sunlight glared off the hood, painting the windshield in blinding streaks. David narrowed his eyes, fighting the fatigue that came not from exhaustion, but from the sameness of it all. He had seen war, had walked through cities where every corner hid danger, where life and death balanced on a thread. Compared to that, the quiet patrols of Silver Creek should have been peace. But sometimes the silence was its own kind of weight. His thoughts wandered as the farmland rolled past. Memories surfaced without invitation. The smell of sand and gunpowder overseas, the echo of his daughter's laughter in a yard that no longer belonged to him, the hollow sound of his own footsteps returning to an empty house. The past was a long shadow he couldn't quite outrun, even under the merciless desert sun. Ranger shifted beside him, pulling David back into the present. The dog's nose pressed briefly to the gap in the window, sniffing at the dry air. Then he sat straighter, eyes flicking across the horizon. "Relax, boy," David said softly. He reached over, giving a gentle scratch behind the ears. Just heat and dust, nothing more. Still, he knew better than to dismiss Ranger's vigilance. The German shepherd had instincts that outpaced any human's judgment. More than once, he had saved David from danger before it even had a name. The road stretched on. Miles of faded yellow lines slipped beneath them. To their left, fields of brittle corn stood tired under the sun. To their right, open scrubland bled into the horizon. The only movement was a hawk, circling overhead, patient, predatory, its shadow gliding across the ground below. David slowed as they approached a bend where the road cut between two low ridges. He checked his mirrors out of habit. Empty behind, empty ahead. A patrol, like 100 others. But even in the monotony, a certain rhythm bound man and dog together. Every sigh, every small adjustment of posture, every glance carried familiarity. They had been partners long enough to communicate without speaking, to understand each other in ways deeper than language. David found himself whispering, more to himself than to the dog. "Sometimes, I wonder if this road's ever going to show us something different." The heat pressed in. Sweat gathered beneath his collar. He rolled his shoulders, stretched his neck, and tried to push back the restless ache gnawing at him. Ranger, steady as stone, remained focused, ears still pricked toward the unseen. The monotony of patrol life was supposed to be safety. But that afternoon, as the silence deepened and the horizon shimmered like a mirage, it felt less like safety and more like waiting. Neither of them knew it yet, but the road ahead was no longer empty. Destiny was already whispering across the desert floor, carried in the faintest cry that the wind had begun to pull toward them. And Ranger, without knowing why, lifted his head higher, nostrils flaring, ears tilting forward, as if he could already hear what David could not. The cruiser moved at its steady crawl, engine humming low, when Ranger suddenly stiffened. 1 second he had been calm, breathing evenly, eyes scanning the land with practiced patience. The next, his body became a taut wire of muscle and instinct. His ears pricked, nostrils flaring, head turning sharply toward the open desert. David noticed it instantly. He'd learned never to ignore Ranger's sudden changes. "What is it, boy?" His voice was quiet, but alert, the same tone he had once used with soldiers under his command. Ranger didn't answer, of course, but his body spoke. A low rumble built in his throat, a sound that wasn't threat, but warning. His amber eyes locked onto a point beyond the horizon, as if something invisible had broken the monotony of sand and sky. David frowned, scanning the landscape. Nothing moved except the heat waves dancing above the asphalt. The farmland behind them lay still. The desert ahead stretched empty. He slowed the cruiser, tires crunching as they rolled against the edge of the shoulder. "Ranger, heel." The command was crisp, automatic. But the dog didn't obey. He stood now, paws braced on the passenger door, claws scratching faintly against the metal. His ears strained forward, head cocked, muscles trembling with a tension David could feel through the air itself. The growl deepened. David's pulse quickened. Ranger wasn't reckless. Disobedience wasn't in his nature. If he ignored a command, it meant instinct was screaming louder than training. "Easy," David muttered, lifting a hand. "Talk to me, partner. What do you hear?" And then, David heard it too. At first it was so faint, he thought it might be the wind whistling through the fence line. A thin, broken sound, carried across miles of empty space. He rolled down the window. Heat punched through the glass, thick and dry. But with it came something else. A sound too human, too fragile to be mistaken. A cry. Not the cry of an animal. Not the voice of a grown man or woman. Higher. Weaker. Desperate. A baby. The hair on the back of David's neck rose. He cut the engine, and in the sudden silence the sound came again. Barely there, snatched by the desert wind, but undeniable. A child's cry. Ranger barked once, sharp and urgent, the sound echoing off the emptiness. His body leaned forward, every fiber demanding action. David's hands tightened on the wheel, his training warred with his disbelief. A baby, out here. Miles from town, in the dead heart of farmland and desert. It didn't make sense. And yet, there it was again, the faint, raw wail of life. "Jesus," he whispered. Ranger turned his head, locking eyes with him. It was not the look of a dog awaiting permission. It was a command of its own. Move. David's heart pounded. His first instinct was procedure. Call it in, wait for backup. But he already knew the radio signals were patchy in this dead zone. And besides, there was no time. That sound wasn't a warning. It was a plea. He leaned toward the dog, voice low but firm. "Stay." But Ranger didn't. The shepherd launched forward with a sudden force, claws scraping, leash snapping taut in David's hand. He growled, barked again, pulling hard toward the open desert. His muscles surged with a strength born of desperation. "Ranger!" David braced himself, heels digging against the cruiser's floor. He wrapped the leash around his wrist, commanding, "Heel! Sit! Hold!" The words meant nothing now. Ranger strained against him, throat rumbling, ears locked toward the unseen. His entire body screamed that something fragile and endangered waited in the silence. David's chest tightened. He felt the pull not only on his wrist, but in his gut. This wasn't random. This was instinct sharpened into certainty. And he knew from years of partnership, Ranger's certainty was never wrong. The cry came again, faint but clearer this time. It lifted above the hum of cicadas, thin and brittle like glass about to shatter. David froze, his breath caught in his chest. He looked toward the horizon where the sound drifted from. Empty, endless sand. No houses. No farms. Nothing but desolation. And yet, There it was. A baby's cry, alive in the deadest place. Ranger jerked hard, yanking David half out of his seat. His growl was no longer warning but urgency. The shepherd's entire frame trembled with the need to run. David met his partner's gaze again. In those amber eyes he saw no doubt, no hesitation, only truth. He released a slow breath, the desert pressing down on him, the cry still ringing in his ears. "All right, partner," he whispered. His voice broke against the heat. "Show me." He unclipped the leash. Ranger exploded into motion. A streak of black and tan muscle across the asphalt, paws pounding dust into the air. He tore toward the sound that only instinct could follow. David scrambled from the cruiser, heart racing, heat crushing him like a weight. He shouted, "Ranger!" But it wasn't a command this time. It was faith. The shepherd didn't look back. He was already vanishing into the distance, running not with hesitation, but with destiny. David sprinted after him, boots hammering against the road, lungs burning. The faint cry carried again, thin but steady, as if the desert itself was calling him forward. And in that instant, David knew their patrol had ended. Something greater had begun. The leash slipped like a snake through David's damp fingers. For a heartbeat, he still believed he had control. His hand clamped hard, muscles straining, but Ranger's surge was too fierce, too certain. The German shepherd lunged with the full force of his body, ripping free from David's grip, as though the bond of leather and steel meant nothing against instinct. "Ranger!" David's shout cracked through the heat, sharp as gunfire. The dog didn't slow. His paws struck the baked asphalt with the rhythm of a drumbeat, then kicked up dust as he veered off the road, nose to the wind, ears locked forward. He ran with a singular clarity, every muscle honed toward something invisible, something only he could sense. David's boots pounded after him, lungs burning, sweat rolling down his temples. Each stride sank into the sand at the road's edge, dragging him down. His breath came ragged, his uniform clinging to his skin in the desert furnace. He should have been furious. This was disobedience, the very thing he trained Ranger never to allow. But beneath the frustration lived something deeper: trust. David knew his partner's instincts were never wrong. Ranger was moving with a certainty no human could summon. The faint cry came again, carried on the wind, fragile, almost drowned in the heat, but there, undeniable, a baby's voice. David's heart lurched. He stumbled, caught himself, and pressed harder into his run. The desert blurred around him. Nothing about this made sense, but he no longer doubted. Ranger was right. Ahead, the shepherd cut across the scrubland with breathtaking speed, tail streaming behind, body low, powerful legs eating the ground. He didn't hesitate, didn't falter. He was a creature born for this, instinct married to purpose. David pushed harder, his breath ragged. "Go, boy!" he shouted, not as a command, but as permission. The words tore from his throat, carried into the silence like a vow. Ranger didn't look back. He never did when the path was clear. His figure grew smaller against the endless stretch of desert, a streak of black and tan against the gold dust. David forced his legs to keep moving, his body screaming in protest. The heat wrapped him like chains, dragging him down, but adrenaline kept him upright. His mind flicked back to years ago, to patrols in another desert, Afghanistan, where he had trusted dogs like Ranger to sniff out explosives, to save lives with instincts sharper than any machine. He remembered the moment he first took Ranger on as a partner, the unspoken oath they both accepted. Trust beyond reason. Now that oath was alive again, burning in his chest. The cry pierced the wind once more, closer now. David's heart clenched. It wasn't imagination. It wasn't a trick of the heat. There was a child out here, alone, abandoned, The thought sent a cold shiver through the furnace of heat. Who could do such a thing? Dust whipped around him as he pressed on, legs heavy, lungs searing. Ahead, Ranger slowed just enough to cast his nose against the wind, circling once before surging forward again, a compass fixed on the sound of life. David's pace faltered, but his eyes never left the shepherd. In that instant, something shifted inside him. The patrol wasn't routine anymore. The empty farmland, the endless road, the silence, they had all been leading to this. He had thought monotony was his curse, but perhaps monotony had been camouflage, hiding destiny until this very moment. "Find it, boy," he whispered hoarsely, forcing air into his chest. "Find it." Ranger darted left, weaving between brittle shrubs, ears pinned forward, growl vibrating low as though the earth itself trembled with urgency. His paws tore the ground, carving a path David could only follow. The desert cry came again, clearer this time, thin, weak, fragile, but alive. David's chest constricted. He nearly stumbled again, not from exhaustion, but from the surge of hope and horror colliding inside him. He pressed forward, legs burning, every ounce of his training and endurance bent on not falling behind. Ranger was leading him somewhere no map could mark, no call could guide. The patrol, the endless sameness of his days, had fractured. He knew it in his bones. Nothing would be the same after this. Dust swirled in the wake of the shepherd. David's boots followed, hammering the desert floor, each stride a prayer he didn't have words for. Ranger barked suddenly, loud, sharp, a call that made the silence shiver. It wasn't the bark of warning. It was the bark of discovery. David pushed harder, breath tearing from his throat. His vision blurred in the heat, but he followed the sound, heart pounding with a mix of dread and urgency. Ahead, just beyond the ripple of the horizon, something waited. The desert road no longer stretched empty. It held a secret. And with each stride, David knew they were running not toward danger, but toward destiny. The desert spread like a furnace, its silence broken only by the thunder of Ranger's paws. The shepherd slowed suddenly, nose sweeping low across the sand, ears pinned forward with laser focus. His body tensed, every instinct narrowing to a single point. Then he stopped. Just ahead, beneath the crooked shadow of a weathered milestone, lay the wicker basket. Its edges were rimmed with dust, its blanket frayed and clinging to the fabric of heat. From within came a fragile sound, the thin, strained cry of a newborn struggling against the weight of the sun. Ranger moved with deliberate caution, as though aware of the life he approached. His strong body circled the basket once, tail rigid, nostrils flaring with each shallow breath the baby gave. He lowered his head, sniffing gently, then lifted it again, scanning the horizon for threats. His growl rumbled low, not at the infant, but at the desert itself, as though daring it to come closer. Then he made his choice. The shepherd stepped closer, planting his paws firmly in the dust beside the basket. His chest expanded with a heavy breath. Slowly, deliberately, he lowered himself, body angling across the sun so his shadow fell over the frail bundle. His stance was instinctive, primal, yet it carried all the weight of a vow. The baby shifted, fists no bigger than marbles, rising weakly from the folds of the blanket. Her skin was reddened from heat, lips dry, eyelids fluttering as though too heavy to keep open. A whimper slipped from her throat, soft and broken, barely enough to disturb the silence. Ranger pressed closer, nose brushing the blanket, the faint scent of salt and milk filling his senses. He whined softly, a sound almost tender, then lay fully against the earth, his flank shielding the basket from the worst of the sun. The contrast was striking. His body, muscular, powerful, scarred from a dozen scrapes and battles in service, was now curved gently around a life that weighed less than one of his paws. His breath came slow and steady, ruffling the edge of the blanket, as though lending his rhythm to the child, who had none. The baby's tiny hand stirred again, finding the edge of his fur. For a moment, impossibly, her fingers curled into it. She clung, not with strength, but with instinct, seeking life where it pulsed most strongly. Ranger did not move. He only lowered his head further, pressing his muzzle close until his warm breath washed over her fragile skin. The cries softened, replaced by a faint, uncertain quiet. The desert held its breath. In that moment, the scene was a portrait of contrast, the brute force of a creature bred for discipline, muscle, and survival, bent entirely to the service of something infinitely fragile. Power had become shelter. Instinct had become mercy. The sun still blazed above, merciless and indifferent, but Ranger's body formed a shield. His ears flicked at every whisper of wind, his eyes scanning the horizon without pause. Every part of him was alert, a sentinel standing guard over innocence. The baby shifted again, her breath shallow but steady. A whimper broke the silence, then faded into something almost like rest. Her tiny fist remained tangled in his fur, the connection as delicate as a spider's thread, yet stronger than any chain. Ranger's growl returned, low and steady, but this time it was not for threat, it was promise. Dust swirled in the hot air around them, coating his back, settling into the basket. Still he did not move. His body remained a wall between the child and the sun, between weakness and death. From a distance, David Miller stumbled into view, chest heaving, boots kicking sand, eyes wide with disbelief. But for now, the world had narrowed to a single tableau, a German shepherd crouched in the desert, muscles trembling with vigilance, and beneath his shadow, a newborn whose cries had softened into silence. The road had carried betrayal. The desert had held abandonment. But here, in the unlikely union of fur and fragile flesh, it now held something else, a fragile miracle. David's lungs burned as he stumbled over the uneven ground, boots kicking up clouds of dust that clung to his sweat-drenched shirt. His heart hammered in his chest, the sound nearly drowning out the faint cries he had been chasing. He had imagined many possibilities, a wounded hiker, a lost animal, but nothing prepared him for what unfolded as he crested the rise. The sight stopped him cold. There, beneath the crooked shadow of a roadside milestone, lay a wicker basket. Its edges were weathered with dust, its blanket faintly stirring in the dry wind. And crouched over it, like a sentinel forged from shadow and muscle, was Ranger. The German shepherd's body stretched across the sand, angled to block the worst of the sunlight. His ears twitched, his head lowered, his amber eyes burning with a feral protectiveness. David's breath caught. His throat closed as he took in the tiny figure inside the basket. A baby, red-skinned from heat, lips cracked, arms twitching weakly against the suffocating air. Her cry was faint now, more whimper than wail, a fragile thread stretched thin against the vast silence of the desert. For a long moment, David could only stand there, unable to reconcile the image before him. A baby. Here, on a roadside where no one lived, no one traveled. The absurdity of it nearly knocked him to his knees. Ranger growled softly, as David approached, a sound not meant for his partner, but for the world itself. A declaration that the child was under his guard. "Easy, boy," David whispered, voice shaking. His hand hovered in the air, hesitant, as though the silence around them might shatter with the wrong movement. "I see her. I see." His training jolted him back into motion. With trembling fingers, he unclipped the radio from his shoulder and pressed the call button. "Dispatch, this is Unit 12. Urgent request." Static crackled. Nothing else. He turned the dial, pressed again. "Dispatch, come in." Only static, louder this time, like the desert mocking him. David swore under his breath. He adjusted the antenna, tried a third time, but the dead zone swallowed his calls. No backup, no paramedics, no one but him, Ranger, and the fragile life fighting to breathe beneath a tattered blanket. The weight of it pressed down on him. Procedure screamed in one ear, "Secure the scene. Call for medical assistance. Preserve evidence." Humanity screamed louder in the other. "Kneel down. Pick up that child. Don't waste another second." David's chest rose and fell with violent force. He took a halting step forward. Ranger's growl deepened, teeth flashing for a heartbeat before he caught himself. His eyes met David's, conflicted, fierce, unwilling to relinquish his guard. David's hand shook as he lowered himself to one knee in the dust. He was close enough now to see the infant's face clearly. Her eyelids fluttered, lashes clumped with sweat. A faint line of dust streaked her forehead. Her tiny chest rose and fell shallowly. So shallow David thought for a moment it might stop altogether. "Oh God!" The words slipped out before he could stop them. He reached forward, then stopped, hovering inches above the basket. His training still clawed at him. Don't contaminate evidence. Don't compromise the scene. But the sight of that small fist twitching against the blanket, the rasp of her uneven breath, tore through every rule he had ever memorized. He lowered his hand until his fingers brushed the blanket's edge. Warm. Too warm. He could feel the heat radiating off her fragile body. She wouldn't last long in this furnace. David swallowed hard, glancing at Ranger. The shepherd's body remained taut, but his eyes softened when they locked with David's again. For the first time since they had begun their patrol, the roles had shifted. Ranger had found the child. Ranger had chosen. Now it was David's turn to decide. Slowly, carefully, he reached deeper into the basket. His hands slid beneath the infant, cradling her head and body with the gentleness of a man who knew the weight of life and loss. The baby stirred weakly, a whimper breaking from her dry lips. "There you go," David whispered hoarsely, his throat tightening. "I've got you now. You're safe." The words were meant as comfort, but they sounded more like a prayer. For a moment, he simply held her there in the desert silence, her impossibly small body against his calloused hands. Everything else fell away. The endless road, the unforgiving sun, even the years of his own battles. All that remained was the fragile beat of her pulse beneath his fingers and the weight of responsibility settling into his chest. Ranger exhaled heavily, a sound between a sigh and a release of tension. He shifted closer, pressing his flank against David's knee, his eyes still fixed outward, guarding them both. David looked down at his partner, his voice breaking. "You saved her, boy. You damn well saved her." The baby whimpered again, her voice thin but alive. Against all odds, in a place designed to erase every trace of weakness, she had been found. And as David knelt there, holding her beneath the watchful guard of a German shepherd. He realized something irreversible had just begun. The patrol was over. The routine was gone. They had stepped into something larger than themselves, an unfolding destiny written in dust and silence. The desert shimmered, heat waves rising like ghosts from the ground. David knelt in the dust, the infant cradled against his chest, her weight so impossibly light it felt as though he held nothing more than breath itself. Yet every shallow rise and fall of her chest burned into him, a reminder that this was not nothing. This was life, fragile, flickering, demanding. Ranger stood close, his body a wall of muscle and fur, his shadow stretching over them both. His amber eyes never stopped scanning the horizon, ears twitching at every whisper of wind. But when David shifted, adjusting his grip on the baby, Ranger's growl rumbled low in his chest. David froze. The shepherd's lips curled just enough to reveal the edge of teeth, not in hatred, but in warning. Even his own partner, his closest ally, was not exempt from suspicion. To Ranger, this child was no ordinary discovery. She was something sacred, and the dog would allow no harm, not even from the man he trusted most. "Easy," David murmured, keeping his voice calm. He raised his free hand slowly, palm open. "It's me, boy. Just me." Ranger's eyes narrowed, body taut. The growl deepened. For a heartbeat, man and dog locked in a silent battle of will, training against instinct, trust against feral protectiveness. David's throat tightened. He had been in firefights overseas, had stood against men with rifles aimed square at his chest. But nothing unsettled him quite like the sight of his own partner, every nerve alive, daring him to take one wrong step toward the infant. The baby stirred, her weak cries breaking through the silence. Her tiny fists trembled against the blanket. The sound sliced through Ranger's tension like a blade. His growl softened into a whine. He stepped closer, lowering his massive head until his nose brushed the child's hand. The infant's fingers opened and closed, grazing his fur. Then, astonishingly, they curled against him, clutching as though she had always known he was there. Ranger licked her hand gently, his tongue rough but his touch impossibly tender. And just like that, the crying stilled. The baby exhaled a sound closer to a sigh than a wail, her chest rising in a rhythm that felt steadier. The desert heat still pressed down, merciless as ever, but in Ranger's presence, she found something resembling peace. David let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. His chest tightened, not from fear, but from the sudden, piercing emotion of it. "You're a damn miracle, boy," he whispered. For the first time since the discovery, Ranger's eyes lifted to meet his. The warning had not vanished entirely, but something new gleamed there. Permission, an unspoken message. "You can hold her, but she's mine to guard." David nodded, accepting the pact. Carefully, he adjusted the baby in his arms, letting the blanket shield her from the worst of the dust. Ranger moved with him, pressing his flank against David's side, as if forming a barricade no desert sun or shadow could breach. The tableau was unshakable. A man kneeling in the dirt, a child clutched close to his chest, and a shepherd pressed against them both. Growl turned into vigilance. David glanced down at the baby, her small hands still tangled in the dog's fur, her lips parting in soft, shallow breaths. The fragility of her existence cut into him like glass. She had been abandoned to die in a place designed to erase every trace of weakness. Yet somehow she had been found, not by luck, but by instinct. He thought of procedure, of evidence, of protocols drilled into him across years of service. None of it mattered here. This wasn't about checklists or chain of custody. This was about survival, about humanity, about something greater than the sum of training manuals. "All right," he murmured, voice trembling with conviction. "The three of us, then." Ranger's ear flicked at his words, his gaze sliding back to the horizon, always watchful. The shepherd didn't need to understand language to understand meaning. His presence was its own vow. David's mind spun with questions he couldn't yet answer. Who would abandon a child here? How long had she been left beneath that milestone, her life balanced on the edge of silence? But answers would come later. For now, only one truth mattered. She was alive, and they were three. The desert around them seemed to acknowledge the bond. The air was still harsh, the ground still cracked with thirst. But for the first time since stepping from his cruiser, David no longer felt crushed by emptiness. Instead, he felt the weight of responsibility settle into him, not as a burden, but as a strange kind of gift. He looked at Ranger again, at the tension still rippling under the shepherd's skin, at the unwavering guard he kept, and he understood. This was no longer just his patrol. This was theirs. Together, they had stumbled upon something that would alter every mile of road ahead. The trio, man, dog, and child, had been formed in the middle of nowhere, bound not by blood, but by instinct, by choice, by something larger than any of them could name. And in the searing silence of the desert, David realized that destiny sometimes began not with trumpets or sirens, but with a cry too faint to hear until a dog's heart carried it across the wind. The highway stretched ahead in a straight, merciless line, heat rising off the asphalt like smoke from an endless fire. The sun was still high, painting the desert in shades of white and gold. Through it all came the slow, rattling thunder of an old semi. Jack Turner sat behind the wheel, his gnarled hands gripping it with the same steadiness he had carried for more than 40 years. The truck had long since retired from long hauls, but like him, it had never quite stopped moving. Its paint was chipped, its engine coughed with age, but it still carried loads when asked. Today, it bore sacks of grain bound for a co-op 2 towns over. Nothing glamorous, nothing urgent. Just a job to keep his hands busy and his heart distracted. The cab smelled faintly of diesel and old coffee. The dashboard was cluttered with faded photographs, held in place by cracked tape. His wife Margaret, smiling in a sundress beside a 4th of July picnic table. His daughter Emily, her gap-toothed grin caught forever in a school portrait. 2 faces he had not touched in years. 2 voices he still heard in the quiet of the night. Jack shifted gears, the truck groaning as it climbed a gentle rise. He knew every sound of this machine, the stutter of the valves, the way the steering leaned to the right when the wind hit from the west. To him, it was less of a vehicle than a companion, a song of metal and memory. The road had been his life. He had spent decades chasing miles, from one state to another, hauling freight across mountains and plains. He had loved it once. The freedom, the solitude, the way the horizon always promised something new. But freedom had turned into exile after Margaret's cancer took her, and exile had hardened into silence after Emily's accident. A drunk driver, a phone call in the middle of the night. The wheel shuddered beneath his hands as though echoing the tremor in his chest. He reached for the thermos on the passenger seat, unscrewed the cap, and took a sip of coffee gone lukewarm. It tasted bitter, but he didn't mind. Life was bitter. The coffee was honest about it. He drove with the window cracked, letting the hot wind whip against his face. It carried dust, and the faint smell of dry sagebrush. Once, Margaret used to scold him for keeping the window open in such heat, said he'd dry himself into leather before 60. Now, at 65, he smiled faintly at the memory. She had been right. His skin was tough and weathered, creased by sun and sorrow, but the air made him feel less caged. Jack hummed under his breath, a tuneless murmur that blended with the rumble of the truck. Sometimes he sang old country songs to fill the silence, songs Margaret used to dance to in their kitchen. Today, he couldn't find the words. His voice caught in his throat before it could form them. The semi rattled as it hit a dip in the asphalt. The sacks of grain shifted in the trailer with a dull thump. Jack adjusted the mirror automatically, checking the straps, though he had tied them tight. Years on the road had carved habits into his bones, always checking, always listening, always waiting for the unexpected. And yet, in all those miles, he had never expected the emptiness of his house when he returned at night. The hollow ache of silence where Margaret's laughter had been, where Emily's music had drifted down the hall. He filled it with motion. He drove. He worked. He let the hum of the engine drown the ghosts. His gaze wandered to the horizon, where the desert blurred into sky. For a fleeting moment, he imagined he saw his daughter's figure there, small and bright, waving to him from the roadside as she once had when he returned from a trip. He blinked hard, and the shimmer vanished, replaced only by heat waves. "Get a hold of yourself, old man," he muttered, his voice rasping in the cab. He rubbed a hand across his jaw, rough with grey stubble. His bones ached more these days, his knees stiff after too many hours sitting still. He sometimes wondered if the truck would outlast him. It seemed determined to keep moving long after everything else had stopped. The engine rattled again, a sound that once might have worried him, but now felt almost like a heartbeat. It was imperfect, flawed but steady. Like him, like the life he still carried, despite everything. Jack Turner drove on, the old engine singing its weary song, the road stretching endlessly before him. His thoughts wandered between past and present, between memory and silence. He had no idea that just ahead, the quiet would break, that the steady monotony of his grief would soon collide with something so fragile and improbable that it would shake the dust from his soul. For now, though, it was only the hum of tires, the weight of loss, and the song of an engine that refused to quit. The semi rumbled along, its tired pistons knocking like an old man's cough, when Jack Turner noticed something on the horizon that didn't belong. At first, it was no more than a flicker, a dark shape against the white shimmer of heat. He narrowed his eyes, lifting a hand to shield them from the glare. Movement. He eased his foot off the accelerator. The engine grumbled in protest, but the truck began to slow. The sacks of grain shifted again in the trailer, with a soft thud. Jack's pulse quickened. Out here, miles from town, there wasn't supposed to be anyone. The desert was empty most afternoons, save for the hawks and the dust. Yet there it was again, a shadow, a form. As the distance closed, the figure sharpened into view. A dog. Not just any stray, either. Jack knew dogs. He had grown up with mutts on the farm, had hauled cattle with heelers nipping at their flanks. But this was no farm dog. The animal stood tall and lean, its stance radiating authority. A German shepherd. The truck crawled nearer until Jack's eyes caught the rest of the scene. His foot pressed instinctively on the brake. The old semi shuddered, gears whining, as the vehicle slowed to a halt on the shoulder. Beside the shepherd, nestled against the crooked shadow of a roadside milestone, lay a wicker basket. Jack's breath left him in a rasp. The dog didn't flinch at the sound of the truck. He stood rigid, tail low but steady, body angled as though shielding what lay at his side. His ears pricked, eyes locked on the lumbering machine that had interrupted the silence. Jack killed the engine. The sudden quiet felt heavy, unnatural. The only sound now was the faint creak of metal cooling and the steady thrum of his own heartbeat. He pushed open the cab door, the hinges squealing in protest, and stepped down onto the gravel. His boots sank into the dust with a crunch. Heat wrapped around him instantly, the kind that made a man's lungs feel as though they were lined with fire. The shepherd's gaze never wavered. A low growl vibrated in his chest, not loud, but enough to carry across the distance, enough to say, "This is mine. Come closer, and you'll answer to me." Jack stopped in his tracks. His weathered face tightened, confusion and awe battling inside him. His gaze slid past the shepherd to the basket. The blanket stirred faintly, a flicker of pale fabric in the heat. Then he heard it, thin, broken, impossibly fragile. A cry. The sound was so small it barely reached him, yet it struck his chest like a hammer. Jack staggered back half a step, his hand rising instinctively to his mouth. For an instant he thought his ears had tricked him, that the desert was playing cruel games with echoes and mirages. But then it came again, a whimper, high and weak, the unmistakable voice of a newborn. His throat worked around words that barely formed. "Lord Almighty." The shepherd's growl deepened at the sound, his body lowering slightly, muscles coiled like wire. His amber eyes blazed with warning, but also something else. Purpose. Jack lifted both hands slowly, palms open. His voice cracked with disbelief. "Easy there, boy. I'm not here to take what's yours." The heat pressed against him, sweat trickling down the grooves of his weathered face. His heart pounded, not just from fear, but from the surreal weight of the moment. A baby out here in the dead heart of nowhere, and a shepherd standing guard as if the desert itself had assigned him the task. The old trucker's knees weakened. He had seen many things on the road, wrecks, storms, the lonely dead of night, but nothing like this. Nothing that made him feel as though heaven and earth had collided in the silence of the desert. He shook his head slowly, muttering again, his voice like sandpaper. "Lord Almighty, what have I stumbled on?" The shepherd did not move. The basket rustled faintly. The cry rose once more, thinner this time, fading into the heat. Jack Turner, widower, father without a child, stood frozen on the side of a desert road, staring at a tableau that felt carved out of myth. A guardian in fur, a child abandoned, and a silence that demanded witness. Jack Turner stood frozen in the searing heat, boots sunk in dust, his breath caught somewhere between disbelief and awe. The German shepherd hadn't moved an inch, every line of his body braced like a soldier at post. The growl in his throat was steady, low, and unyielding, a warning that no man, not even one with weathered hands and kind eyes, would be allowed near the wicker basket. Jack took one careful step forward, instinct pulling him closer to the cry that had pierced his soul. Immediately, Ranger's growl sharpened, ears pinned back, body lowering protectively over the child. His amber eyes blazed, daring Jack to test the line between them. All right, Jack whispered, lifting both hands, palms outward. His voice was gravelly, shaped by years of smoke and sorrow. "I'm not here to hurt anybody." The shepherd's body tightened, his chest rising in quick bursts. Dust swirled around them both, a storm of heat and silence. "Ranger!" The voice cracked across the distance, familiar authority wrapped in fatigue. David Miller stumbled into view, his uniform darkened with sweat, his breath ragged from the sprint. His eyes darted from Jack to the shepherd, then to the fragile bundle pressed against the milestone. David raised a hand, commanding calm. "Easy, boy. He's not the enemy." Ranger's growl softened, but didn't vanish. He shifted slightly, nose brushing the baby's blanket, as if to remind them both who his loyalty belonged to. Jack's gaze fell at last on the child. His chest constricted. The world seemed to tilt. The baby's face was streaked with dust, her lips cracked, her fists twitching in weak protest against the sweltering heat. She was impossibly small, fragile in a way that made Jack's breath stutter in his throat. His vision blurred, not from the glare of the sun, but from the sudden rush of tears that filled his eyes. Memories slammed into him with cruel force. Emily. His daughter. The last time he had seen her alive was at the door of their house, waving as he climbed into this very truck. She had been wearing a yellow dress, sunlight caught in her hair. Hours later, the drunk driver took her life away. He had replayed that moment for years, the wave, the smile, the last unspoken words he never returned. And now, this child, left alone in the desert, crying into silence that could have swallowed her whole. Jack staggered closer, his hand half raised, trembling. "My God," his voice broke, rasping like torn paper. "She's just a baby." Ranger snarled again, snapping the air in front of him. The shepherd pressed his body tighter against the basket, his message clear. "Not you. Not yet." David stepped quickly between them, one arm raised toward Jack, the other steadying Ranger with a firm touch against his back. "He's protecting the baby," David said, voice steady despite the pounding in his chest. "That's all this is. He doesn't trust anyone right now. Not even me at first." Jack's throat worked as he swallowed hard. His grief-stricken eyes stayed locked on the child, his heart breaking open in the furnace of the desert. "She shouldn't be here," he whispered. The words trembled with rage, sorrow, and something dangerously close to desperation. "She should never have been left like this." David nodded grimly. His own voice softened. "I know. But she's alive. Because of him." He rested his hand firmly on Ranger's flank. "We'll get her out of this." The shepherd's growl faded into a whine. His gaze flicked between the two men, then returned to the baby. He lowered his head, licking the child's tiny hand where it had wriggled free of the blanket. The touch was so gentle it was almost reverent. The baby stirred. Her cry quieted into a soft murmur. Her fingers curled weakly into Ranger's fur, as though she had chosen her guardian long before either man had arrived. Jack's knees threatened to give way. He pressed a trembling hand to his chest, where his heart seemed ready to tear itself apart. The image before him was too much, too cruel, too beautiful. He whispered again, voice barely audible. "She looks like her." David turned, brow furrowed. "Like who?" Jack's eyes glistened with tears as he forced the words past the ache in his throat. "My daughter. Emily." The silence that followed was thick with weight. Neither man could break. Ranger filled it instead, standing his vigil over the basket, his fur brushing against the child's skin, his body a barrier against the merciless sun. David placed a steady hand on Jack's shoulder. His grip was firm, grounding. "Then maybe you were meant to be here," he said quietly. "To see her, to remember, to help." Jack closed his eyes, his face twisted with grief and something like surrender. He nodded once, slowly. When he opened them again, the desert seemed less empty. There, in the middle of nowhere, a trio had formed. An officer still haunted by wars he couldn't forget, a dog bound by an instinct deeper than words, and an old trucker whose grief had found a fragile mirror in the dust. The baby whimpered softly, then settled again as Ranger licked her hand once more. Jack watched, tears spilling down his weathered cheeks, and whispered into the silence, "Then let me stand with you." The desert sun hammered down, white and merciless, on the three figures clustered around the basket. The baby's cries had faded to thin whimpers, shallow breaths rattling in her chest. David knelt in the dust, his pulse racing as he studied her. Her skin burned red, lips cracked, her tiny chest rising in uneven gasps. Training told him the truth instantly. Dehydration, exposure, seconds from collapse. He ripped off his uniform jacket and spread it above the basket, a flimsy shield against the sun. The baby stirred faintly in the shade, her hand twitching as if still clinging to life. "Hold on, little one," David whispered, his voice breaking. Beside him, Ranger pressed close, body shielding where the jacket could not. The shepherd's steady breaths cooled the stifling air. His eyes locked on the child, as though she were his only charge. A few steps away, Jack Turner stood stricken. He had seen wrecks and storms, but nothing like this. Something so fragile, fading under the sky's cruelty. His fists trembled uselessly at his sides before he finally rasped, "She won't make it if we wait. Miller, we drive." David shook his head. "Radio's dead. No signal." "Then we don't wait," Jack shot back, jerking a thumb toward his old semi. "Hospital's an hour if I push it. Less if she's lucky." David looked down at the baby again. Every shallow rise of her chest pressed against him like a verdict. The rule book in his head, secure the scene, wait for backup, crumbled under the weight of her tiny gasps. He glanced at Ranger. The shepherd's amber eyes were steady, demanding only one answer. Move. David swore under his breath, then nodded. "All right, we drive." Jack bolted toward the truck, while David slid his arms under the child. She was feather-light, terrifyingly so. He pressed her to his chest, whispering, "Stay with me. Just a little longer." Ranger rose at once, pacing close against his leg, unwilling to let them carry her alone. Together, they staggered through the heat toward the waiting semi. The horizon shimmered. The cab door stood open, and Jack's voice barked from inside. "Get in! Now!" David climbed the steps, the jacket draped over the baby like a shield. Ranger bounded in after them, planting himself on the floor, his gaze locked fiercely on the child. The cab reeked of diesel and sweat, the dash cluttered with faded photographs. David barely saw them. His entire world was the faint heat of the infant's body against his chest. Jack slammed the door and shoved the rig into gear. The semi roared, coughing black smoke before lurching forward, its growl matching the urgency in Jack's chest. Inside, the air was thick with fear and determination. David rocked the baby gently, whispering, "We're not losing you. Not today." Ranger stretched across the floor like a sentry, pressing his nose to her tiny foot, as if daring death to reach her again. On the roadside, David had almost left the basket behind. He had reached to tug it free of the sand, when Ranger's growl froze him. The shepherd snapped taut, barking sharply, planting himself between man and basket. "Ranger," David started. But the dog barked again, desperate, driving his nose against the wicker as if declaring, "Mine to guard." Jack shouted from the cab, "We don't have time for this, Miller." David crouched low, meeting Ranger's wild gaze. "Listen to me. You found her. You protected her. But we can't save her here. Trust me." Ranger's growl softened into a whine. At last he stepped back, reluctant but yielding. David scooped up the basket, and the shepherd pressed so close beside him, it was like a shadow refusing to detach. The moment they reached the cab, Ranger leapt in first, wedging himself between seat and floorboard. His amber eyes never left the baby. Jack muttered, "I'll be damned." Dog's not letting her out of his sight. The semi barreled down the highway, dust pluming behind it like smoke from a battlefield. The engine rattled, photos taped to the dash, trembling with every jolt. Jack's jaw was tight, sweat streaking his lined face. David sat rigid, the baby clutched in his arms. Each shallow breath she drew made his own chest tighten. Ranger hovered inches from her, breath steady, tongue gently brushing her tiny hand until her whimpers faded. David's throat caught. He brushed his fingers over Ranger's fur. "Good boy. Keep her with us." Jack's eyes flicked to the mirror. His voice rasped, half prayer, half command. "Hold on, little one. Just hold on." He pressed harder on the accelerator, the old rig groaning but pushing forward. The speedometer trembled. Dust swirled higher, curling into a white banner above the desert road. Inside the cab, time felt suspended. 3 breaths, David's, Ranger's, the child's, wove together in fragile harmony. "You're not alone anymore," David whispered to the baby. "You've got us now. You've got him." He nodded toward Ranger. "And he won't let go." The shepherd pressed his nose against the baby's cheek. She stirred faintly, her body loosening against David's chest, as if comforted by fur and warmth. Jack's voice broke the silence. "Ever seen anything like this?" David shook his head. "Not once, and I hope I never do again." The desert blurred past, telephone poles flashing like sentries. The semi groaned but held steady, each mile clawed from the sun's grip. Jack drove as though chased by ghosts, his daughter's face in the photographs watching him, urging him not to fail again. David kept his eyes fixed on the child's face, watching each twitch, each shallow rise of her chest. He whispered, more to himself than her, "Not here. Not today." Ranger never moved from his post, his amber eyes unblinking, his breath steady over the baby's skin. His vow was silent, but absolute. The horizon shimmered closer, promising the faint outline of the hospital. None of them knew if they would make it in time. But together they carried more than a child. They carried defiance, hope, and the raw promise of survival. The old truck roared, its engine straining, tires pounding the cracked asphalt. And behind them, the dust rose higher, a ghostly trail marking the line they had crossed, from abandonment to rescue, from silence to life. It was more than a truck thundering down a highway. It was salvation, steel, sweat, and loyalty hurtling against the desert's cruelty, a baby in arms, a shepherd guarding her. 2 men, bound by chance, refusing to surrender. Life carried forward. The semi groaned into the emergency bay like a war horse staggering home from battle. Brakes hissed, the engine coughed, and when the rig finally stopped, dust rolled across the asphalt, clinging to the glass doors of the trauma center. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Nurses and orderlies froze at the sight of an 18-wheeler where ambulances belonged. Through the dirty windshield, they glimpsed 3 figures pressed close together in the cab. Jack Turner was the first to climb down. His boots struck pavement with a hollow thud, his shoulders sagging from the long drive. Raising his arm, he bellowed, "We've got a baby!" The words cracked the silence. A gurney screeched forward. 2 doctors burst through the sliding doors, coats flaring. David followed, cradling the infant against his chest, his jacket shielding her face. Sweat streaked his uniform, but his grip was steady. And then Ranger leapt down, hackles raised, planting himself against David's leg. His growl rolled low, not hostile but protective. The staff froze at the tableau. A dusty officer with a newborn, a trucker at his side, and a shepherd standing guard. A nurse whispered, almost reverent, "It's a miracle he's alive." Urgency returned. A doctor reached for the child, only for Ranger to snap a bark, sharp as a gunshot. The staff recoiled. David steadied the moment. "Easy, boy," he murmured. Then to the doctors, "He won't let anyone near until he knows it's safe." Jack's voice cracked. "Don't mind us. Don't mind the dog. Just help him." The baby whimpered, fist stirring against the shepherd's fur. Ranger lowered his head, licking the tiny hand with such tenderness that the staff gasped. David crouched, letting the child cling to fur one last time, before whispering, "We're not leaving him, boy. We're giving him help. To safety." Ranger's growl softened. Reluctantly, he stepped aside. David eased the infant into the doctor's arms. The gurney rolled forward, staff swarming. Ranger padded beside them, uninvited but unstoppable. Inside, fluorescent light replaced the desert glare. Dr. Elena Ruiz, seasoned pediatrician, strode forward. She had seen battered children, gasping newborns, but never one carried from a semi, guarded by a shepherd who refused to yield. "Bring him in here," she called, pointing to a glass-walled exam room. David laid the baby down gently, his jacket still draped over the frail body. Ruiz snapped on gloves. "Vitals," she ordered. Sensors pressed to skin. Oxygen slipped beneath tiny nostrils. A monitor beeped in stuttering rhythm. "Severely dehydrated," Ruiz murmured. "Sunburn, but no fractures. Weak, but alive." She brushed damp hair from the infant's forehead. "Strong little fighter." David staggered back, drained. Jack hovered near the doorway, hat clutched tight. And Ranger, barred from entry, pressed his nose to the glass, pacing, whining at every beep. The baby whimpered. Ranger barked once, mournful. "He stays," David said firmly, his voice cracking. Ruiz studied the shepherd, then nodded. "Let him wait. He'll settle when the child does." Pee fluids dripped into a tiny arm. Oxygen hissed softly. The monitor steadied, each beep surer than the last. David pressed his hand against the glass, whispering thanks through a clenched throat. Jack's voice was hoarse. "He's gonna make it, right?" Ruiz looked up. "If he survived the desert, he can survive this. His body's weak, but he's fighting. And sometimes, fighting is enough." Jack bowed his head, tears cutting through dust. For a moment, in the glass reflection, he thought he saw Emily, his daughter, smiling faintly. Ranger barked again, circling until the baby's cry softened into steadier breaths. At last, the shepherd lay against the door, head on paws, eyes never leaving the child. Whispers spread faster than the monitors could beep. A dog saved a baby. First at triage, then pediatrics, then the waiting rooms. Visitors repeated it like scripture. A German shepherd found a baby in the desert. David slumped against the wall, exhaustion bowing his head. Jack sat nearby, hat in his hands. They didn't speak, but silence bound them. Inside, the baby, swaddled now, IV steady, oxygen flowing, looked softer, less raw with suffering. Ranger pressed closer to the glass, fogging it with each breath. Staff slowed as they passed, whispering at the sight. "He won't even blink," one nurse murmured. "It's like the baby belongs to him," another said. At the nurse's station, a clerk frowned. No name on the chart yet. A colleague glanced toward the shepherd. "Then maybe we give him one." "What do you mean?" Her gaze softened. "Daniel. After the officer who carried him in. Strong name. Survivor's name." The clerk chuckled, but wrote it carefully. Baby Daniel. Within the hour, it was what everyone called him. Daniel's vitals are stabilizing. Daniel opened his eyes. Daniel's a fighter, just like the shepherd who found him. David stiffened when he heard it first. Daniel. The word pressed into his chest, heavier than his badge, but true. Jack's eyes glistened when the name passed by. He mouthed it silently. Daniel. And though grief for Emily flared, it was tempered by hope. Maybe life had given him one more chance. Their eyes met across the hall. Neither spoke, but both knew something larger than them had begun. Inside, Ranger whined softly. The baby stirred, fingers twitching against the blanket, as if reaching for the unseen guardian at the door. The shepherd's tail flicked once. A nurse whispered, awed, "He answers the dog, like he knows." The baby's monitor beeped steady. Oxygen hissed. IV fluids flowed. Against the odds, life had fought back, and the whispers kept spreading. A dog saved a baby. The baby's name is Daniel. Miracles still walk the earth. 2 weeks after the desert rescue, the child was stronger. His cheeks held color now, his cries sharp and insistent, his lungs filled with the stubborn will that had carried him through heat and silence. To the hospital staff, he was Daniel. To Ranger, he was a charge never left unguarded. To David and Jack, he had become more than a child. He had a purpose, but purpose has enemies. The hospital lobby erupted that afternoon with sounds that didn't belong, heels clicking, shutters snapping, the metallic whir of rolling camera rigs. At the center of the sudden storm was Richard Coleman. Flanked by lawyers, he strode in with grief, carefully staged for cameras. A silver frame clutched to his chest bore Daniel's photo. A stack of forged ransom notes dangled in his other hand. Behind him trailed a pack of reporters. "My son," Richard declared hoarsely, voice pitched to echo through the lobby, "was kidnapped." The words slammed the air. Gasps rose from staff and visitors. A nurse leaned over the counter, stunned at the jagged notes spread before her. Reporters scribbled furiously, flashes flaring across the polished tiles. Richard bowed his head, squeezing out practiced sorrow. "I thought I'd lost him forever. And now, by miracle, he's been returned." The lobby filled with sympathy, quick and unthinking. To cameras, he was a father in grief. To those upstairs, he was something else entirely. From the pediatric wing balcony, David Miller froze. He recognized the face from investigative briefings, the wealthy man whose name had hovered around whispers and files. Jack Turner stood beside him, fists trembling. "He's flipping it," Jack rasped, "making himself the victim." David's gut twisted. He saw the headlines forming already, money bending truth into rumor. Richard's voice rose again, perfectly broken. "I thank whoever found him, and I promise, as his father, I'll never let him out of my sight again." The lobby burst in flashbulbs. But above, David and Jack exchanged a single glance. It carried no words, only fury. At their feet, Ranger growled. The shepherd pressed against the glass, amber eyes locked on the man below. The sound that rumbled from him carried more truth than the lobby full of microphones. The mask cracked sooner than Richard expected. Jack Turner descended the stairs like a man dragging chains of memory. His boots struck sharp against the tile. "You left that child to die." The lobby froze. Cameras swung. Nurses stiffened. The words cut the theater in half. Richard blinked, caught off guard for an instant, before snapping back into performance. "Excuse me?" "You heard me?" Jack's weathered face burned red. "You're no victim. You abandoned him in the desert like trash." His voice cracked, memory bleeding into fury. "I buried my daughter because of recklessness. I'll be damned if I watch another man walk away from what he's done." Gasps rippled. Reporters leaned forward, pens scratching harder. Richard raised both hands, feigning outrage. "That's a vile lie. This man doesn't know me. Family doesn't abandon its own," Jack thundered, jabbing a finger toward the ward above. "That baby's no family to you." Richard's lawyers surged forward, shouting down questions, but the chaos was cut short by a growl. Ranger, the shepherd, stepped forward, body coiled tight, eyes fixed on Richard with ferocity no human mask could withstand. His growl deepened until the walls seemed to vibrate with it. For the first time, Richard's composure cracked. His eyes flicked nervously toward the dog, jaw clenching. Cameras caught it all, the faint tremor, the guilt flashing like lightning behind his eyes. "He's trained against me," Richard snapped desperately, pointing. "This is harassment." But his words fell flat. The room wasn't watching him anymore. They were watching the dog, watching truth written in muscle and instinct. A nurse whispered what everyone was already thinking. "The dog knows." And like fire across dry grass, it spread. "The dog knows." Lawyers hustled Richard toward the exit, shielding him in expensive fabric. But not even their bodies could block the image burned into every lens. A man, shrinking under the growl of loyalty. By late afternoon, signatures and stamped papers bent the law as Richard had planned. Money and influence had their way. The infant was no longer under hospital care. David stood rigid in the pediatric wing, fists clenched at his sides, Ranger pressed tight against his leg. Jack hunched on a chair, hat gripped so hard it might tear, his face pale with fury. A nurse brought the swaddled baby forward, his breaths fragile, but strong enough to stir. When she hesitated, Richard stepped forward, immaculate in his suit, arms outstretched for the cameras. The handoff broke the illusion. The moment Daniel touched his arms, his body stiffened. His fists balled, his tiny face contorted, and he screamed. A raw, piercing cry tore through the sterile hallway. Richard faltered, jostling him awkwardly. He forced a smile for the cameras, but the wail only rose, louder, desperate, unrelenting. In the shepherd's presence, the child had found peace. In Richard's arms, he found only terror. Ranger erupted, barking furiously, lunging against David's grip. His growl thundered like judgment itself, his entire body straining toward the child. Nurses gasped. Reporters turned their lenses, recording the sharp contrast. Calm with the dog, screams with the father. David's voice cut through the chaos, raw and damning. "You hear that? He knows who you are." Richard's mask slipped, irritation flashing in his eyes before indignation covered it again. "He's frightened. Any child would cry after such an ordeal. He's my son. I'll comfort him." He pressed the child tighter, but it looked more like possession than care. Jack rose slowly, trembling with fury. His voice carried, hoarse, but steady. "You left that boy in the desert." "That's slander," Richard snapped. Jack's voice dropped to a whisper, yet it silenced the corridor. "Truth will come." The words hung heavier than the baby's cries. Reporters froze mid-scribble. Even the lawyers glanced uneasily at one another. But the law had already been signed. The baby, Daniel to those who had saved him, nameless to the man who claimed him, was carried away down the hall, his screams echoing long after they vanished around the corner. David exhaled, chest hollow. Jack clutched his hat like a mourner at the graveside. And Ranger, trembling, lost a single mournful howl before sinking onto the tile, ears flat, eyes burning. It was not an ending. It was a theft. But in the echo of Jack's whisper and the dog's growl, one truth lingered. The desert had not killed him. Lies would not either. Truth would come. Jack Turner's house had always been too quiet. The small clapboard home on the edge of town carried silence like a wound. No laughter, no music, no footsteps. Only the hum of the refrigerator and the groan of old wood when the desert wind shifted. 2 weeks after Richard Coleman had walked out of the hospital with Daniel in his arms, that silence pressed heavier than ever. Jack rarely slept. Each night he replayed the baby's cries echoing down the sterile hallway, cries that cut through him like a blade. Ranger, the German shepherd, paced too, restless in the dark, as if he too still heard the sound of a child taken from safety. On the 14th night, a knock came at Jack's door. Not the sharp knock of a salesman, but soft, hesitant, uncertain. He rose slowly, joints aching, and opened the door. A woman stood on the porch, grey streaks in her dark braid, a leather notebook clutched to her chest. Her eyes were sharp but tired, like someone who had carried a secret too long. "Mr. Turner?" she asked carefully. "Yes, ma'am." She drew a trembling breath. "My name is Mariana Soto. I was a nurse for 35 years. I retired last spring, and this is about the baby, the one they're calling Daniel." Jack's chest tightened. He opened the door wider. "Come inside." The living room was plain, worn furniture, and old photographs on the wall. Ranger rose from the rug, ears twitching. He padded forward, sniffing Mariana, then sat by Jack's chair, as if already weighing her intent. She perched on the sofa, notebook trembling in her hands. When she opened it, pages filled with notes and phone numbers stared back. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "I was volunteering at the hospital when the baby came in." The police were tracing emergency calls. There was one that day, a report of a baby abandoned in the desert. The caller hung up quickly, but the system caught the number. Jack leaned forward, his weathered face tightening. "And?" Mariana pressed a page toward him. Numbers were scrawled neatly, underlined twice. Beneath them, she had written, "Coleman Industries, Internal Extension." Her hands shook. That number belongs to Richard Coleman's company. He knew about the abandonment before anyone else. He reported it himself. The room seemed to tilt under Jack's feet. Ranger gave a low whine, sensing the weight of the moment. Jack touched the notebook as if to test its reality. "Why bring this to me? Why not the police?" Her eyes brimmed with sorrow. "Because Coleman owns this county. Judges, chiefs, councilmen, they all owe him. If I take this to the station, it disappears by morning. But you were there. You saw the truth. And that dog," her eyes flicked to Ranger, "that dog won't let it die." Jack closed the notebook carefully, his grief hardening into something colder. For the first time since Daniel was taken, he felt not powerless, but armed. You did the right thing. Ranger pressed his muzzle against the notebook in Jack's hands, stamping his silent approval. They met in a diner on the outskirts of town, its neon open sign sputtering like a weak heartbeat. Inside, the air smelled of burnt coffee and grease. Jack sat in the back booth with Mariana, the notebook between them. Ranger stretched on the floor, ears flicking at every sound. David Miller arrived first. Plain clothes, tired eyes, the weight of his badge heavier than ever. He slid into the booth with a weary nod. Sandra Luna came next, tall and broad-shouldered, once a police commander, retired under whispers of refusing Coleman's money. Her boots struck the tile with authority as she sat down. The last to arrive was Roberto Diaz, investigative journalist, his satchel stuffed with notebooks and a battered recorder. He looked worn but sharp, the kind of man who never stopped digging, even when it cost him. Jack slid the notebook across. Roberto scanned quickly, his jaw tightening. "It's from Coleman Industries," Mariana said softly. "The call that reported the abandoned baby. His company's number." Sandra muttered a curse. "Damn fool got sloppy." Roberto shook his head. "Not sloppy enough. He'll say it was an employee. A prank. Men like him don't break from one scrap of evidence. You need to stack it until it crushes him." David's voice was grim. "Then we pile it." Sandra's eyes hardened. "Understand what you're stepping into. Coleman has judges, chiefs, politicians. You go at him head on. You don't just lose, you disappear." Jack's hands tightened on his mug. His voice shook, but held steel. "He left that boy in the desert. I heard his cries when Coleman tried to take him back. I won't sit quiet." Mariana's voice trembled, but she nodded. "Neither will I." Roberto tapped the notebook. "Then we build it in the shadows, piece by piece. When it breaks, it has to break so wide, no judge or spin doctor can bury it." Silence pressed the booth. Only the clink of dishes in the distance filled the gap. Finally, David exhaled. "If we prove abandonment, he loses everything." Sandra leaned in. "Then we trace it. Phone records, bank transfers, witnesses. Anything that ties him to that road." Roberto's voice steadied. "This is the first stone. Let's build the wall." Jack looked around the booth. The weary cop, the retired commander, the trembling nurse, the relentless journalist. None young, none invincible, but all willing. He whispered, almost to himself, "For Daniel." Ranger's ears pricked at the name, a low growl vibrating in his chest. Agreement. In the flicker of failing neon, among burnt coffee and hushed voices, an alliance was born, not out of power or wealth, but conviction. Something larger than Richard Coleman had begun. Back at Jack's house, the silence was no longer empty. Ranger filled it, pacing hall to hall, circling the front door, standing rigid at the porch. At night, Jack woke to the sound of whines, the shepherd pressing his nose to the window, eyes locked toward the highway into town. The first night, Jack thought about coyotes. The second, he wondered. The third, when Ranger's mournful howl shivered his spine, Jack knew. This wasn't about animals in the desert. This was about Daniel. Jack joined him at the window, laying a hand on the trembling dog. "You feel it, don't you, boy? He's not safe." The shepherd's amber eyes glinted in the moonlight, fierce and certain. Jack sat heavily in his chair, memories pressing close. His daughter Emily's cries the night of the crash he couldn't stop. Ranger had been there for Daniel, and now the dog's refusal to rest was a prophecy. By dawn, Jack had made up his mind. He pulled Mariana's notebook from the table, the digits underlined in ink staring back like a wound. He thought of Sandra's eyes, Roberto's vow, David's weary defiance, and above all, the baby's cries. Cries not of hunger, but rejection. He looked down at Ranger, who stood rigid, gaze locked on him. "You're right," Jack whispered. "He's not safe. Not while Coleman's got him. And we can't wait. We keep digging." Ranger gave a sharp huff, agreement plain. Jack slipped the notebook into his jacket. His hand lingered on the shepherd's neck, grounding himself in that steady presence. "All right then," he said, voice rough but resolved. "We won't rest, either." As morning light spilled across the desert horizon, Jack felt it. The dog's pacing hadn't been anxiety. It had been a summons, a reminder that truth claws its way out of silence. He straightened, grief for Emily hardening into purpose for Daniel. Beside him, Ranger stood watch at the window, eyes fixed on the road leading toward Richard Coleman. The child was not safe, but they would not stop until he was. The bar was nearly empty, its neon sign flickering weakly against cracked windows. Red light spilled across the booths, painting the cracked leather with a dull glow. Smoke lingered in the air despite the no smoking sign, ignored like everything else in this place. In the corner sat Roberto Diaz, nursing black coffee. His recorder, hidden in his jacket, hummed silently, its red light concealed. Across from him slouched Vargas, Richard Coleman's longtime partner, now a man hollowed by secrets. His suit was wrinkled, his tie loose, his hands shaking as he poured whiskey into a half-full glass. "Why'd you call me?" Vargas muttered, voice defensive, eyes darting. "You know it's suicide talking about Richard." Roberto leaned forward, tone calm but relentless. "Because you're already drowning. Richard built his empire on silence, but silence doesn't last forever." Vargas's throat worked as he swallowed. His gaze flicked toward the door, then back, his hand trembling. "I can't." "You can." Roberto cut in softly. "Because you know what he did, and because one day, when this all burns down, you don't want to be left with nothing but guilt." The words hung heavy. For a long moment, only the hum of the neon filled the silence. Then Vargas exhaled, setting his glass down with a clink. He rubbed his face, voice breaking. "He told me," he whispered. "He told me he couldn't risk the scandal. A child showing up at his house, questions being asked." So he drove out into the desert, left the boy under a milestone. Roberto's chest tightened. His expression didn't change, but his recorder caught every syllable. "I begged him not to," Vargas went on, eyes glistening. "Told him people would find out. But Richard just laughed. Said the desert erases everything. Said no one would ever know." His bitterness grew sharper. "But I knew. I lived with it every damn day. And when the police found that baby alive, when cameras showed up, Richard came to me, said, 'You keep your mouth shut, or I'll bury you with him.'" Roberto's gaze sharpened. "So you stayed quiet." Vargas's hand slammed the table, startling a patron nearby. "He blackmailed me, used my debts, my family. He's got everything in his grip, but I can't carry it anymore." Roberto steadied his jacket, making sure the recorder caught every word. His voice was calm, deliberate. "Then let it go. Put it on record." The man sagged, paranoia etched in his every movement. And then, with a trembling breath, he spoke the words that sealed Richard Coleman's fate. He left that baby to die. I helped cover it. And when the ransom story broke, lies. Every note, every photo. Richard made it up. I wrote some myself. Forged the handwriting. Mailed them from out of state. All of it. A performance. The confession spilled like poison. Roberto sat still, letting him unravel. Every word a nail in Richard's mask of respectability. Finally, Vargas buried his face in his hands. I've damned myself, but maybe this clears some of the stain. Roberto closed his notebook slowly, as though sealing the moment. It doesn't clear everything, but it's a start. He rose, adjusting his satchel, the recorder warm against his chest. He looked down at Vargas, broken over his whiskey. When this comes out, Richard won't be the only one answering. But you, his voice softened. You chose to speak. That may be the only thing that saves you. Vargas said nothing, only stared into his glass, haunted. Outside, the night air struck Roberto like a baptism. Cool, cleansing, alive with the weight of truth, captured at last. Richard Coleman had abandoned that child, lied, fabricated, blackmailed. And now, his own partner had confessed. For the first time, Roberto felt it. The tide was shifting. The diner's back room smelled of stale coffee and old paper. Blinds drawn, lights dimmed, secrecy hung thick in the air. Around the scarred wooden table sat the Fragile Alliance: Jack Turner, David Miller, Sandra Luna, Mariana Soto, and Roberto Diaz. Ranger lay on the floor, head on his paws, amber eyes flicking between them. Silent, but anchoring them all. Roberto set his recorder down, its light blinking before he switched it off. His voice carried restrained triumph. Vargas confessed. On record. Richard abandoned the baby, staged the kidnapping, and blackmailed his own partner. Jack's jaw flexed, hands tightening on his hat. Good. But words won't be enough. Not against a man like him. Sandra's eyes were sharp. He'll say Vargas was drunk, bitter, a liar. One voice won't topple him. Roberto's lips curved faintly. That's why we don't stop at one. From his satchel, he spread files across the table. Grainy photos, spreadsheets, call logs, each piece fragile alone, devastating together. First, he said, sliding a photo forward. A silver Mercedes parked at a desert gas station. The timestamp matched the day Daniel was abandoned. David leaned closer. That's his county plates match. Sandra's jaw tightened. So, he was out there. Roberto produced another sheet. Phone logs. Second, an outgoing call to the emergency line. Same day. Same time. From a Coleman Industries extension. The number Mariana traced. Mariana straightened, her voice trembling but sure. Then it's true. He reported it himself, thinking no one would connect it. Next came the bank transfers. Payments to Vargas, Roberto said. Labeled consulting fees. But the invoices don't exist. The amounts match silence. Jack exhaled hard, staring at the files as if they were scripture. It's enough, he whispered. Enough to bury him. Sandra folded her arms. It's strong, but it must be airtight. One weak link, and his lawyers shred it. We stitch it into a timeline, motive, action, cover-up. And when it breaks so wide, no one can bury it. David's frustration boiled over. So we wait, while he keeps that baby? His voice cracked. Every day under that roof is another day of danger. At the word, Ranger lifted his head, growling low. Roberto steadied his tone. If we rush, it collapses. If we build carefully, when it falls like a hammer. Jack's knuckles whitened around his hat. Hammer can't come soon enough. Sandra rested a steady hand on his arm. It will. And when it does, it won't just knock him down. It'll break the chains he's wrapped around this county. Silence filled the room. Files lay spread like weapons. Ranger padded forward, nosing the photo of the Mercedes, his amber eyes locking on Jack's. Jack's throat tightened. He whispered, more to the dog than the room. We're getting him back, aren't we, boy? The shepherd gave a soft whine, tail flicking once. Answer enough. Dawn broke cold over Richard Coleman's mansion. Its white pillars and manicured lawns glowed in pale gold, a fortress of wealth. From the outside it looked untouchable, but power built on lies is brittle. That morning, it cracked. Engines rumbled up the driveway. Patrol cars rolled in, lights dark until the last moment. Behind them, a van carried officers in tactical gear. The air was sharp, electric with justice long delayed. Inside, Richard Coleman slept beneath silk sheets, unaware the walls he trusted were closing in. The command came over the radio. Boots pounded marble steps. Shouts shattered the quiet. Police! Open up! Servants froze in the corridors, pale with shock. A second later, the oak doors burst inward. Officers poured through, weapons drawn, voices clipped and sharp. Richard stumbled into the foyer, robe clutched, hair wild from sleep. His eyes widened with outrage. What the hell is this? Sandra Luna stood just behind the lead officer, her gaze steady, her presence commanding even in retirement. Her words cut like steel. Richard Coleman, you are under arrest for child endangerment, falsification of evidence, and criminal conspiracy. The charge thundered through the hall. Richard's face flushed crimson. This is absurd. I'm the victim. I was blackmailed, kidnapped. Handcuffs snapped around his wrists. The metallic click carried like a verdict. No, no! His voice rose, shrill with desperation. You can't do this! Do you know who I am? I'll bury you all in lawsuits! The officers ignored him, dragging him toward the door. On the staircase, a cry broke the chaos. Eleanor, his wife, clutched the railing, silk gown pressed to her chest. Her eyes widened at the sight of cuffs. Richard, her voice cracked. Tell me this isn't true. Richard twisted, mask shattered, voice wild. They're lying, Ellie. It's all lies. But his frantic eyes betrayed him. The look of a man cornered not by lies, but by truth, unchained. Sandra's gaze never wavered. It's over, Coleman. And for the first time, it was. Eleanor's sobs echoed down the marble stairs as her husband was dragged across the polished floor. The mansion that once stood as a monument to power now felt like a hollow shell, its silence filled with betrayal. Outside, the sun broke the horizon. Reporters who had been tipped off by Roberto Diaz were already gathered at the gates, cameras flashing as officers escorted Richard in handcuffs across the manicured lawn. His protests turned shrill, his words lost beneath the thunder of shutter clicks. Lies. All lies. I'm innocent. But the image was immortalized in that moment. The powerful businessman dragged from his fortress at dawn, his empire crumbling beneath the weight of his own sins. David Miller stood at the edge of the crowd, arms crossed, his face carved with grim satisfaction. Jack Turner was beside him, hat in his hands, his old eyes shining with tears he didn't bother to hide. Ranger sat at Jack's feet, tail stiff, his gaze fixed on the scene with a quiet intensity, as though recognizing the end of a hunt. The shepherd gave one short bark, sharp and certain, a sound not of warning, but of closure. Jack whispered, his voice trembling. Truth came, boy. Just like we said it would. Behind them, Roberto adjusted the strap of his satchel, his recorder tucked safely inside. He didn't smile, but there was a fire in his eyes. The fire of a man who had finally pulled truth into the light. Eleanor's cries still carried faintly from the mansion, the sound of a woman who had built her life on a lie only to watch it crumble in one morning. But no one moved to comfort her. The sympathy had shifted. It belonged to a child who had once lain in the desert, and to a dog who had refused to let the world forget him. The courthouse was a building of stone and glass, cold in its architecture. But on that morning, its halls hummed with something warmer, expectation. The case had been swift, the evidence undeniable. Richard Coleman, once untouchable, had been shackled not only by handcuffs, but by his own lies. His fall cleared the way for something greater to rise. The judge's gavel struck once, sharp as thunder. Custody of the minor, formerly under the guardianship of Richard Coleman, is hereby granted to Jack Turner. The words echoed in the chamber, final and irrevocable. Jack sat frozen for a moment, his old hands trembling on the brim of his weathered hat. He had braced himself for disappointment, for the cruel twist of law that so often bowed to wealth. But here, at last, the law had bent toward truth, toward love. His chest swelled with a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding for months. David Miller, seated just behind him, leaned forward and pressed a hand to his shoulder. His voice was quiet, steady. It's done, Jack. He's yours. Jack's throat worked, but no words came. His eyes blurred with tears, and in that haze, he saw the bailiff bringing forward the child. The baby the world now called Gabriel. The name had been formalized at last, chosen by Jack, honored by the court. Gabriel. A name that meant messenger, bearer of good news. The infant, now healthier, cheeks round with the fullness of recovery, squirmed gently in the arms of the social worker who carried him forward. His eyes, dark and curious, blinked at the light filtering through the courtroom windows. And then, Ranger moved. The shepherd had been lying patiently at David's feet throughout the proceedings, silent as stone, though his eyes never strayed from the child. But the moment Gabriel was brought into the chamber, Ranger surged forward, his tail wagging furiously, nails clicking against the polished wood floor. The bailiff startled, but David raised a calming hand. It's all right. Let him. The social worker knelt, lowering Gabriel into Jack's waiting arms. The old man cradled the child close, his breath catching at the weight of him, the warmth of him. Tears slipped down his cheeks, unchecked, falling onto the baby's blanket. Ranger pressed in immediately, tail swishing, his muzzle brushing the child's face. He licked once, gently, then again, more urgently, until Gabriel squealed with something that wasn't a cry at all, but the beginning of laughter. The sound rang through the courtroom like a bell, startling, beautiful, pure. The judge smiled faintly, her gavel resting silent now. The bailiff exhaled. Even the reporters tucked at the back lowered their cameras, momentarily stunned into reverence. Jack's voice cracked as he whispered to the baby, rocking him gently. "You're home now, Gabriel. You're home." Ranger's tail beat harder, his body wriggling with unrestrained joy. He licked Gabriel's tiny hand, then his cheek, each touch tender as a vow. The infant's fists opened and closed, grasping clumsily at the shepherd's fur, as if to anchor himself to the one constant presence who had never let him go. David watched with a tight throat, his eyes stinging. He had seen battlefields, funerals, betrayals. But this reunion, simple yet profound, was the kind of justice no badge, no gavel, no weapon could ever enforce. It was justice born of loyalty and love. Jack finally looked up, his face streaked with tears, his arms full of the child he had fought for. His gaze found David, then Mariana, then Sandra, then Roberto, each ally who had stood in the shadows and risked themselves for this moment. His voice was rough but certain. "Thank you, all of you. He's got a chance now. We've all given him a chance." Ranger barked once, a sharp, jubilant sound that drew laughter from those watching. It was as though the shepherd, more than any of them, understood the finality of what had just happened. His watch had not ended. No, it would never end. But for the first time, his vigilance was rewarded with peace. Jack bent his head, kissing Gabriel's soft hair. The baby gurgled, his eyes fluttering, and then he sighed, nestling against Jack's chest as though he knew, instinctively, that he had finally found safety. The judge cleared her throat softly. "Mr. Turner, you may take your grandson home." She paused, correcting herself with a small smile. "No, your son." Jack's lips trembled, his heart swelling at the word. "Yes, ma'am," he whispered. "My son." The courtroom emptied slowly after that, but for Jack the world had already shifted. He stepped into the sunlight outside with Gabriel cradled in his arms. Ranger pressed close at his side, and for the first time in years, the old man felt the weight of grief lift just enough for joy to settle in its place. Reporters shouted questions, cameras flashed, but Jack hardly heard them. All he heard was Gabriel's soft coo, all he saw was Ranger's wagging tail, and all he felt was the warmth of new life pressed against his chest. The desert road had nearly claimed the child. But now the road ahead belonged to them. And as Ranger licked Gabriel's face again, drawing another squeal of laughter, the old man whispered into the bright morning air, "Pure joy. That's what you've given us, boy." The Turner house had not sounded like this in decades. Where once silence reigned, broken only by the hum of appliances and the creak of old floorboards, now laughter carried through the walls, spilling into the yard, weaving through the trees like sunlight. A year had passed since the gavel fell in that courthouse, and in that time, the home of Jack Turner had transformed. On a warm spring afternoon, the yard was alive. The grass, once patchy and faded, had been reseeded, soft and green beneath tiny bare feet. A swing set stood at the edge of the property, its chains glinting in the sunlight, its seats creaking as they swayed in the breeze. Plastic toys dotted the lawn, bright blocks, a red wagon, a scattering of balls that seemed to multiply daily. And in the middle of it all was Gabriel. No longer the fragile infant they had pulled from the desert. He was a sturdy toddler now, his legs unsteady but determined. His tiny arms flailed for balance as he toddled across the yard, cheeks flushed with the exertion of discovery. Each step was a triumph, each stumble followed by a quick push back to his feet, laughter bubbling from his lips. Close behind him, never more than a pace away, was Ranger. The shepherd had aged in the past year, greyer around the muzzle, slower in the mornings, but his devotion had only deepened. His amber eyes tracked every wobble of Gabriel's legs, every tilt of his small body. When the child stumbled, Ranger pressed close, steadying him with the warmth of his flank, a living guardrail of fur and loyalty. "Easy there, Gabriel," Jack called from the porch. His voice carried the gravel of age, but today it was laced with a warmth that had been missing for so long. He sat in a rocking chair, hat tipped back, watching the scene with eyes that glistened more often now with joy than sorrow. Gabriel turned toward him, at the sound of his name, a grin spreading wide across his face. "Papa Jack!" he squealed in his toddler's lilt, before tripping over his own foot and collapsing into the grass with a soft thud. Ranger was there in an instant, nose nudging the boy upright, tail wagging in encouragement. Gabriel giggled, wrapping his small arms around the shepherd's neck in a clumsy embrace. The sight pierced Jack's chest with a sweetness so sharp it hurt. Once, the old man's house had been a shrine to absence, his daughter's empty room untouched, his wife's belongings packed away in silence. Grief had lived in every corner. But now there was life again. Jack rose slowly from the chair, his joints stiff but his step steady. He walked into the yard, the breeze tugging gently at his shirt. Gabriel noticed him coming and squealed again, stumbling forward as fast as his little legs would carry him. Jack bent low, scooping him up into arms still strong despite the years. Gabriel smelled of grass and sunshine, his hair damp with sweat, his giggles ringing against Jack's ear. The old man pressed a kiss to the child's head, his eyes closing briefly. "You've filled this place, boy. You've filled it right up." Ranger pressed close, tail thumping against Jack's leg, his head nudging Gabriel's side as if to remind them both he belonged to all of them. The three stood there in the sunlight, framed by laughter and green, a family pieced together not by blood, but by survival, by choice, by love. Neighbors had noticed the change too. Where once the Turner place had been quiet, now the sound of Gabriel's laughter drifted into the street. Children from nearby houses came to play on the swings. Mothers stopped by with baked goods, fathers with offers to fix fences or plant gardens. What had been the loneliest house on the block was now the heart of it. Jack often sat on the porch in the evenings, Gabriel asleep in his lap, Ranger at his feet. He would watch the stars come out, his heart heavy but full. Heavy with the memory of Emily, the daughter he had lost, but full with the joy of the boy he had gained. Sometimes he whispered to the night, words meant for his wife and daughter. "He's safe. He's loved. I'm doing right by him." This afternoon, as the sun dipped low, Jack set Gabriel back on the ground. The toddler tottered off toward the swings, Ranger trotting faithfully behind. Jack leaned on the porch rail, his lips curling into a smile as he watched. It was a simple scene, a child at play, a dog standing guard, an old man watching over them both. But to Jack Turner, it was more than simple. It was sacred. His once empty home was full again. Full of noise, full of color, full of life. And as Gabriel's laughter rose into the sky, mingling with the steady rhythm of Ranger's protective presence, Jack knew one truth beyond all doubt. They had walked a road of betrayal, of silence, of nearly unthinkable loss. But that road had led here, toward family, toward love, toward a future neither desert nor lies could ever steal again. The desert looked different in the light of memory. A year had passed, yet the stretch of road remained the same. Lonely, scorched, endless. The milestone still stood, weathered and scarred by the elements, its shadow falling short against the wide, unbroken sand. For most who passed, it was nothing more than a marker along an unforgiving highway. But for Jack Turner, it was sacred ground. He parked his old pickup on the shoulder, dust swirling around the wheels. The engine ticked as it cooled, the silence of the desert pressing in like a held breath. Jack stepped out slowly, his hands steady as he lifted Gabriel from the car seat. The boy wriggled in his arms, eager to explore, his dark eyes wide with curiosity. He was no longer the fragile infant found swaddled in that wicker basket. He was a toddler now, sturdy and bright, with laughter that seemed to chase shadows away. Ranger leapt down from the truck bed, his paws stirring the dust. He padded ahead, nose twitching as though he remembered every scent from that day. The fear, the sweat, the silence broken only by faint cries. He circled back quickly, waiting for them, his tail swishing slowly like a pendulum marking time. Jack carried Gabriel toward the milestone, his boots crunching on gravel, the desert wind tugging at his shirt. He paused a few feet away, staring at the place where he had first seen the child, where a dog had stood, unyielding, guarding life against death. He bent down, setting Gabriel on his feet. The boy wobbled for a moment, then steadied himself, clutching Jack's finger with one small hand. Ranger moved close, brushing against Gabriel's side, ever the sentinel. Jack reached into his pocket and drew out a handful of wildflowers, bright against the muted desert. He knelt slowly, knees creaking, and placed them at the base of the milestone. The colors looked fragile against the dust, but they carried life, carried promise. Gabriel tilted his head, eyes curious, then crouched clumsily, patting the flowers with his small hand, as though approving the gesture. Jack's throat tightened at the sight. He placed a hand on the milestone, his palm against the sun-warmed stone. His voice, when it came, was soft. A whisper carried more for the desert and the boy beside him than for his own ears. "This was the road of abandonment," Jack said, his voice breaking under the weight of memory. He looked down at Gabriel, who stood nestled between him and Ranger. "But now, it's the road of love." The words hung in the air, filling the emptiness with something new. Ranger shifted, lifting his head. He let out a single soft bark, the sound low and steady, more salute than command. His tail flicked once, and he stood tall beside them, amber eyes bright against the desert horizon. Jack's chest ached, but not from grief this time, from gratitude, from the miracle of having been chosen by fate to stand on this road, not as a mourner, but as a guardian. He lifted Gabriel into his arms again, pressing the boy close. The toddler laughed, reaching out toward Ranger, his little hand clutching at the shepherd's ear. Ranger huffed softly, patient, as if he understood that this touch was his reward. Together, the three of them stood by the milestone. Man, child, dog, bound not by blood, but by survival, by second chances, by love stronger than betrayal. The desert wind carried on, whispering through dry brush and empty stretches of sand. But where once it had carried only silence and loss, now it carried the sound of laughter. Jack kissed the boy's forehead, his voice steady as he whispered again, "You're safe now, Gabriel. You'll never be left behind again." Ranger barked once more, the final guardian salute echoing across the wide road. And the desert, for the first time, felt less like emptiness and more like memory redeemed. At the heart of this story is something simple but powerful. The way a German shepherd can carry loyalty in his eyes, how a dog's steady presence can fill the empty spaces in a life, and how love, whether from a person or an animal, can heal wounds that once felt unfixable. Ranger never gave up, and because of that, a child's future was rewritten. I think that's why so many of us hold dogs close. They don't ask for perfection. They just ask for our time, our care, and in return, they give us everything they are. That bond, quiet, loyal, enduring, is one of life's greatest gifts. If you've ever wanted to deepen that connection with your own dog, there are gentle resources out there that can help you understand them better and strengthen the trust you already share. And if this story touched you, I hope you'll stay with us for the next one. Sometimes, the best journeys begin with a bark, a wagging tail, and the reminder that love never leaves us.